We're about to put a bow on the 2019 college football season, and there are still plenty of discussion points. Did the playoff committee get the rankings correct? Should Georgia have kept their 4th seed? What would you do if somebody paid you $18 million to not do your job? Did Oregon ruin the Pac-12's only chance to finally get a team into the playoffs? Or maybe you're an Arkansas fan, and if you are, then I'm truly, deeply sorry. But the 2019 season is significant for another reason, being that it's the 150th season of college football, and if you've watched even a minute of the sport this year, you've probably been reminded of that fact about a dozen times. 150 years of college football is a very long time, and the landscape of the sport has gone through some serious changes in that time. I mean, seriously, the geography of college football has changed dramatically since that first season in 1869. So, how has it changed? Why? And after 150 years, how did we end up with this? What if we could map those changes, literally and metaphorically? Well, I've got good news. You can. Well, I can. We can. It can be done, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Welcome to Third and Null, where geography and sports collide. Violently, with leather helmets. The first college football season in 1869 had exactly 2 games, both between Rutgers and Princeton, which was known as the College of New Jersey back then. Each team won 1 game, making that first season a tie. There was a plan to play a third deciding game until officials at both schools protested that the students were paying too much attention to these football matches and not enough attention on academics and studying. Wonder if that's going to be a problem later. Football, or a sport commonly referred to as football, had been played on college campuses for years, but what made this first season significant is that it was the first time that 2 different schools met to play a game against one another. Previously, football was merely an intramural activity, and one that academic officials didn't particularly like. Remember what I said about students ignoring their studies? Yeah. Nevertheless, football spread in popularity throughout the nation. Colleges and universities began fielding teams at a rapid pace to play against one another. These early teams played relatively short schedules against nearby opponents. The first major attempt at organization occurred on the East Coast. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Columbia, and Rutgers became fixtures on each other's calendars thanks to their proximity. With the exception of Rutgers, these teams formed the Intercollegiate Football Association in 1873. Its purpose was to develop and standardize the rules of the game and to schedule matches during the season between the schools. Penn, Brown, and Dartmouth subsequently fielded teams to play these opponents as well, forming the core of what would eventually become the Ivy League. Governing bodies like the IFA started to take shape in other parts of the country as well. The Western Interstate University Football Association, or WIUFA, was established in 1892 by the member schools of Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, and Nebraska in order to schedule matches between one another annually. In the South, North Carolina, Johns Hopkins, Virginia, Alabama, Auburn, Georgia, and Vanderbilt formed the Southern Intercollegiate Athletic Association in 1894. Within 4 years, membership jumped to 19 schools. Interestingly, the formation of the SIAA originated partly on the discussion of athlete eligibility. The conference determined that players had a maximum of 5 years to be eligible to play on intercollegiate sports teams. It prohibited professional athletes from taking part in conference events. It required that athletes had to be enrolled in the schools that they represented, and it banned instructors and professors from participating in the sports. Think really hard about that last one for just a moment. Imagine a professor from your college days and then picture him or her playing football. Apparently it was enough of a problem that the conference just had to address it. Chicago, Illinois, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Northwestern, Purdue, and Michigan banded together to form the Western Conference in 1896, the precursor to the modern Big Ten. Iowa and Indiana would join in 1899 after the WIUFA dissolved in 1897. Also in play were a variety of state intercollegiate athletic associations. Because of the geographic constraints of long-distance travel at the time, many schools found it easier and more convenient to schedule games against nearby in-state opponents. Remember, we're talking about horse-drawn carriages and trains as a primary mode of transportation at this time. So, many schools formed statewide football competitions, much in the same way that modern state high school athletics competitions are organized. Schools in Colorado, Kansas, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Maine, and Maryland banded together to schedule games against one another in this manner. Football took a little bit longer to take hold on the West Coast. Even though it had been played in California since 1891, regional collegiate opponents were sparse, and many Californian schools included local club teams on their schedules. Sometimes schools would see the same opponent multiple times in a given season in order to fill out their schedules. West Coast football also gave the world the first postseason football game when Stanford invited the University of Chicago to San Francisco to play a game on Christmas Day 1894. Make a mental note of that. So here was the landscape of college football in America near the turn of the 20th century. Just a handful of regionalized interstate conferences, a few state associations, and many independent teams fending for themselves and creating brief, primitive schedules every season. One kind of awkward subject that I haven't talked about yet is, well, money. Money has been a part of American sports ever since the first event promoters sold tickets to spectators in order to watch barnstorming baseball teams play against each other in the 1860s. And that entrepreneurial spirit soon engulfed college sports as well. Students on college campuses soon formed athletics associations that fundraised, charged membership dues, sponsored team-specific events, and sold tickets to games. Even alumni groups got in on the act. They were the first booster clubs in America, and sometimes they existed without the approval of school administrators. In fact, school officials took notice of many of these new organizations active on their campuses, and most of them weren't too happy about it. In 1873, the president of Cornell sent a telegram to the University of Michigan after he found out that the two teams were planning a game against one another in Cleveland. His telegram read, "I will not permit 30 men to travel 400 miles merely to agitate a bag of wind." What a beautiful metaphor. I wish we still talked about football that way. Printed media also led to an increase in publicity for these sporting events. As newspapers spread the word far and wide about renowned footballing powerhouses and their accomplishments on the field, students clamored to get these teams included on their schedules, and spectators turned out in the thousands to see their teams take on these prestigious opponents. As football became more and more of a spectator sport, ticket sales generated ample revenue for the schools playing in any given match, who would divide the income from the ticket sales, known as the gate, amongst themselves. Suddenly, football was a money-making venture, and the amount of money that could be made depended on the amount of fans that could be crowded around the football field to watch. And this was money that school administrators found that they had very little control. Another thing that they had very little control over was the nature of the sport itself. Football in America has always been brutal, hovering somewhere between a pleasant sporting match between college-age men and a gladiatorial blood sport. The Intercollegiate Football Association, hey, remember them? Successfully provided the first set of standardized rules, but they couldn't regulate the violence of the game. Remember, players at this time were suffering serious life-threatening injuries. Some of them ended up paralyzed, and some of them even died as a result of their injuries. Theodore Roosevelt, that's President Theodore Roosevelt, met in 1905 with officials from Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, imploring them to find a way to regulate the sport and make it safer. Later that year, the NCAA was formed by 39 charter schools as a rule-making body, and membership would expand quickly to 62. And the geography of college football was about to change once again. Mostly because of money. But it was also through the ideas of this man, William Rainey Harper, then the president of the University of Chicago. Harper saw athletics as an opportunity to advance the interests of the university and generate public attention and revenue for the school. Using marketing strategies, he attracted popular fandom and support for the university, which resulted in very high ticket sales. He also hired early football legend Amos Stagg to be the university's first athletic director, something that had never been done before. An athletic department that was totally independent from the bureaucracy of the university and reported only to the president and the board of trustees was a totally new development in the world of academia in America. Stagg could do essentially whatever he wanted with his athletic department so long as it advanced the university's interest, namely generate more money. This was the first time that college sports became commercialized, and other institutions took notice. Chicago's massive attendance at football games meant that any team that played against them, specifically the 8 other teams in the Western Conference, took home a huge portion of the gate. If other schools wanted a piece of that pie, they needed to adopt the Chicago model, but they also needed a steady stream of revenue from ticket sales. That meant scheduling more games against teams with large fan bases and hoping that those fans turned out in droves on game day to see their team play. A consistent schedule could only be had from a consistent supply of opponents, and that could only be had from a conference. So if you weren't already in a conference, you had to find an existing one to join or start your own. And the floodgates opened. To recap, the Western Conference, which was officially known as the Intercollegiate Conference of Faculty Representatives, still represented the only true conference in the modern sense of the phrase, with a reliable schedule between the member teams, as well as standings and a conference champion crowned at the end of the season. The SIAA had expanded to 20 teams, but did not dole out the title of champion to any one team. In fact, many teams could claim to be the best in any given season, but these titles were mythical. Keep the phrase mythical championship in your mind, because we're going to talk about that later. Finally, the Ivy League was more of a notion than an actual conference. Being the oldest and most prestigious institutions in the United States at the time, as well as the earliest adopters of the game of football, there was an unwritten and unspoken agreement among certain Eastern colleges on athletic relations that amounted to those schools consistently playing against each other every season. So if you were looking to join an existing conference, you were kind of out of luck. The Western Conference wasn't accepting new membership, the SIAA was already way too big, and the Ivy League didn't officially exist, even though pretty much everybody acknowledged that it did. That left the remaining institutions to create their own. One of the first out of the gate was the Missouri Valley Intercollegiate Athletics Association. It formed for the 1907 season, and within 10 years it included Iowa State, Drake, Kansas, Kansas State, Missouri, and Nebraska. In 1909, the Texas Intercollegiate Athletic Association formed. Texas and Texas A&M left the SIAA together and joined with Baylor, TCU, Southwestern College, Trinity University, and Austin College. The league didn't last long though, since 4 of the 7 member schools were so much larger than the others. I'm talking about A&M, Baylor, TCU, and Texas. They actually lost revenue whenever they played against their smaller counterparts. Since ticket sales were naturally so much lower at smaller schools, their share of the gate was lower, and soon the 4 bigger schools left to form the Southwest Conference in 1914. They included SMU, Rice, Oklahoma, Oklahoma State at least for a little while, and Arkansas. By 1920, the SIAA had grown to an untenable level of 30 member schools. The chaos of organizing a conference schedule around such a large number of opponents led the 14 largest schools to break off and start their own conference, the Southern Conference, in 1921. The conference planned to limit membership to a maximum of 16, but by the end of the 1920s, their roster included Kentucky, LSU, Vanderbilt, Tennessee, Mississippi, Mississippi State, Alabama, Auburn, Georgia, Georgia Tech, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, NC State, Virginia, Virginia Tech, Duke, Virginia Military Institute, Clemson, Maryland, and Tulane. Wow, it's a really good thing they got so much smaller, right? What a relief. Out west, the former schools of the Colorado Football Association, Colorado, Colorado State, and Northern Colorado, along with Wyoming, Montana State, Utah, Utah State, and BYU, formed the Rocky Mountain Conference in 1909. Speaking of the Western United States, we haven't really talked about them very much, and there's a very good reason why. Although the NCAA was formed in 1905 with the purpose of regulating the sport and trying to make it safer, schools in California still felt that the sport was way too dangerous, and they did something about it by discontinuing their football programs altogether, beginning in 1906 with UC Berkeley and Stanford. Nevada and USC followed suit in 1911. They replaced their football teams with rugby teams, believing that to be the more safer sport that would soon overtake American football in popularity. There weren't a lot of schools that shared their belief, however, so the rugby-playing schools were forced to schedule matches against local rugby clubs, and even attempted to schedule games against Canadian rugby-playing schools and club teams from Australia and New Zealand. And remember, this is the 1910s. Sailing across the Pacific was approximately a 2-week trip aboard a steamship just to play some rugby matches. After just a few years, school officials realized that the rugby wave wasn't going to take off as they'd hoped, and students and alumni were pressuring the administrators to return to American football. And return they did, first by forming the Pacific Coast Conference in 1915. Starting with Cal, Washington, Oregon, and Oregon State, it would grow to include Washington State, Stanford, UCLA, USC, Idaho, and Montana by 1930. Understandably, as the college football landscape had changed so dramatically in just a few short years, many smaller institutions found themselves left outside of these new conference structures. A trend followed in states where there had previously been statewide athletic associations, where the larger schools in those states had jumped ship for bigger, more prestigious, and wealthier interstate conferences. The schools they left behind, for the most part, simply reorganized themselves into more structured state conferences. Such was the case in Illinois with the IIAC, Indiana with the Indiana Interstate Conference, Ohio with the Buckeye Conference and the Ohio Athletic Conference, the Michigan Collegiate Conference, the Middle Atlantic in Pennsylvania and surrounding states, and the Northeast Conference. The SIAA survived and reorganized, bringing in many more southern schools to fill the space left by the mass exodus in the early 1920s. Out west, the Northern California Conference formed in the wake of the Pacific Coast Conference. Meanwhile, a new conference emerged in the desert Southwest, the Border Intercollegiate Athletic Association. There's one school that I haven't talked about yet that did not find a conference home for itself in this new environment, but still managed to find success almost in spite of itself. Notre Dame had tried to join the Western Conference at times, but Michigan head coach Fielding Yost was able to convince the other Western Conference schools from blocking Notre Dame's entry. He even attempted to block the other Western Conference schools from scheduling Notre Dame altogether. The animosity stemmed from Notre Dame and Michigan's 1909 game, which Notre Dame won for the very first time in the series. When Notre Dame won, Fielding Yost was furious, specifically about the eligibility of certain Notre Dame players and about the strategies that Notre Dame had used during the game. He even went so far as to lobby for a rules change in order to blunt Notre Dame's offense. Without many regional opponents to schedule, Notre Dame looked far away to play against nationally renowned teams. By playing and beating powerhouses like Army, Penn State, Texas, Nebraska, and Georgia Tech, Notre Dame elevated itself into the national consciousness. Their willingness to travel anywhere in the country to play any opponent meant that they made a killing at the gate as spectators flocked to see the famous Fighting Irish play games. They also served as something of a rallying cry for the far-flung community of American Catholic Christians who saw it as a point of pride that a small Catholic private college like Notre Dame was able to play and defeat so many larger public and Protestant schools throughout the nation. Remember when I mentioned the first postseason game between Chicago and Stanford in 1894? Ever since then, the idea of two teams of national renown playing against each other in sunny California after the end of a football season had really caught on. The Rose Bowl, which was first played in 1902, had hosted an annual game beginning in 1916, which pitted a Pacific Coast Conference school against a team from the East. Meanwhile, Notre Dame alumni on the West Coast had been lobbying for the team to come play a game in California at some point. Also, meanwhile, the Western Conference had banned its members from participating in postseason bowl games, believing that the large monetary revenue generated by these games was a stain on the reputation of higher education. The Western Conference. If you don't like it, ban it. Thus, Notre Dame was invited to the 1925 Rose Bowl to play against Stanford, a game they won in front of over 50,000 people. This contest led to USC being added to Notre Dame's annual schedule in a home-and-home series that would net crowds of over 100,000 in years to come. Notre Dame had effectively made themselves into America's first college football brand, and many other schools that couldn't find a conference home for themselves in this new landscape took to emulating their model, and thus the idea of independence in college football was born. And here's what college football looked like in 1930. Is it a mess yet? I think it might be a mess. Yeah, it looks like we got a mess on our hands. Fortunately, the chaos slowed down a little bit, but not because of anything the NCAA or the colleges of America were doing. The Great Depression struck in 1929, and general economic downturn meant that many Americans did not have the disposable income to use on tickets to a college football game. It also meant that even fewer could afford to send their children to colleges, even to small ones. College attendance shrank in the 1930s, and ticket sales to college football games dipped as well. Small colleges began to lose money as endowments dropped. Football was no longer a profitable venture, and many small schools had to shutter their football programs while they were tightening their belts. And when World War II began, America's college-aged men went off to fight. College attendance remained low during the war, but football continued to be played. Relatively little changed in terms of the conferences during this period, except for a few of their names. The Missouri Valley Intercollegiate Athletic Association became widely known as the Big Six to distinguish it from the similarly named Missouri Valley Conference. The Western Conference was also widely called the Big Ten after adding Ohio State in 1912, even though Chicago ended their football participation in 1939, making their member total 9. We might see this naming issue pop up again. The BIAA remained unchanged, although Arizona State, New Mexico State, and UTEP would suspend football temporarily during the war. The Rocky Mountain Conference dissolved and reformed into the Mountain States Conference after dropping Utah State, Montana State, and Northern Colorado. The PCC added Montana, and the Southeastern Conference, wait a minute, the who? Even though the Southern Conference had broken away from the SIAA due to the membership being too high, the membership in the Southern Conference quickly grew to 23 members. Remember, they had originally wanted to limit membership to 16, so once again, the membership in the conference was too high. So in 1932, 13 members of the Southern Conference, Alabama, Auburn, Florida, Georgia, Georgia Tech, Kentucky, LSU, Ole Miss, Mississippi State, Tennessee, Tulane, and Vanderbilt, decided to break off into a new conference, away from the conference they had made by breaking off from another conference. Because these schools represented the Southern Conference members located south and west of the Appalachian Mountains, they appropriately named themselves the Southwest. Wait a minute. No. Yeah. And there. Perfect. The Southern Conference members remained and expanded the ranks, adding Citadel, Furman, Clemson, Wake Forest, Davidson, Richmond, William and Mary, and at the close of World War II, the NCAA looked like this. Is it still confusing? Well, it doesn't matter because it's all about to change again. Why? I just told you, World War II ended. American servicemen coming back from overseas found that they had money in their pockets for the first time in their lives. The Great Depression had robbed Americans of attending college throughout the 1930s, and as the post-war economy boomed, educated employees were a necessity. College attendance jumped, and athletic departments found that they suddenly had an abundance of young men on campus wanting to play varsity football. Another change brought on by the booming economy after the war was that the business leaders throughout the country were suddenly extremely wealthy, and many of them chose to give back to the universities they had attended in the form of generous donations to scholarship funds, or in financing the construction of academic buildings that would later bear their name for ages to come. But some businessmen were a little bit more competitive with their charity. Alumni and local boosters wanted their teams to win. After all, America not only had just fought in World War II, but America had been on the winning side, and Americans were drunk on that victorious feeling. And as General George Patton said,
Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser.
So with their money, these private individuals wanted to buy victory. And in order to buy victory, they had to buy players. Recruiting and compensating college athletes had been going on as far back as the 1920s, despite the official position of conferences and institutions on the principle of amateurism in athletics. But the excesses couldn't be curbed, even crossing over the line into criminal territory sometimes, as coaches, players, and alumni got involved in gambling and point-shaving schemes, among other seedy elements. Most of the extant conferences at the time had principles in their charter that established athlete eligibility, but in general, conferences didn't have the power to enforce their own rules. I mean, conferences were literally conferences. They were groups of academic officials that conferred on matters of athletics and academics. I won't turn this into a discussion of payment of college athletes. I mean, this is a channel about geography and sports after all. But it is important to note at this time of financial and academic and recruiting gray areas, we got our first recruitment scandal. Tensions had always been high in the PCC. Schools really wanted to beat each other on the football field, and many had resorted to using scholarships, financial aid, work programs, and slush funds to attract gifted athletes to campus. It wasn't anything exactly new for the time. Like I said, these activities have been going on in America since the 20s, but a sort of gentleman's agreement amongst universities prevented them from calling each other out. But the PCC was different for two reasons. Number one, they were one of the very few conferences out there at the time that had very strict compliance rules and recruiting standards that were actually enforced by a conference commissioner. And two, they took their rivalries on and off the field to new, somewhat entertaining levels of pettiness. In 1951, Oregon was found guilty of violations after a PCC investigation, and their head coach was forced to resign. Oregon claimed similar violations occurring at UCLA, and a domino effect of finger-pointing took hold in the conference. UCLA conducted an internal investigation, and even though, shocker, nothing would come of it, the PCC tried to reform. Then, in 1956, players at Washington refused to play for a coach that they didn't like. He was fired, and then he promptly opened up the closet to let all the skeletons air out by blowing the whistle on a Washington Booster Club slush fund, which the PCC investigated. Nearly identical charges were brought against UCLA. UCLA then pointed fingers at USC and Cal. Man, that first season of the real university presidents of Orange County was pretty wild. As a result, Cal and UCLA stated their intent to withdraw from the PCC, which disbanded after the 1958 season. Stanford, Cal, USC, UCLA, and Washington then created a new conference altogether, the Academic Association of Western Universities, for the 1959 season. Idaho, Oregon, Oregon State, and Washington State went independent after the disbandment. But eligibility and oversight were about to be put on the back burner for a new development: television. Well, I say new, but in reality, college football games have been televised on regional networks sporadically since 1938. But by 1950, the television revolution was sweeping America, and many schools entered into contracts to have their games broadcast on live TV, notably Penn and Notre Dame. This terrified school administrators because it threatened the very foundation of what made college football a revenue-generating venture. Remember, schools relied on the sale of tickets at the gate in order to generate revenue from their football programs. The advent of television threatened to upend that business model as it enabled football fans to stay at home and watch a game on TV instead of going out to a stadium and paying for a ticket and putting money in the school's pockets. This frightened athletic directors so much that they appealed to the NCAA, which at the time was still a rule-making body staffed by part-time officials. The member schools, and then about 200 strong, relinquished a large portion of their autonomy to the NCAA, allowing it to control and negotiate television contracts, maintain and enforce eligibility standards, and control postseason bowl games. After some revisions, the NCAA and the member institutions worked out a TV contract in 1955. There would be exactly one college football game on TV every week. 8 of those weeks would be broadcasted nationwide, and 5 of those weeks would be devoted to regional broadcasts only. This setup would remain in place for 26 years. So while gate revenue was safe, at least for now, there was a new wrinkle as TV networks began a bidding war for the exclusive college football broadcast contract. As you can imagine, those networks offered a lot of money for that contract. And schools who wanted a piece of that money had to get their games on the TV schedule. Whichever network owned the contract at the time had their pick of the litter, and generally they only picked the most significant or interesting games to put on the TV schedule in any given week. So in order for a school to get on TV, their games had to be significant or interesting, which meant that the teams had to be significant or interesting. In a word, good. Good teams got to be on TV and get a share of the TV revenue, and bad teams didn't. TV was a vehicle for already good and prominent programs to become even more so, as they could expand their reach nationally, they could get a large share of revenue from the TV contract, and they could reach the homes of potential recruits that much more easily. And once again, the floodgates would open. There was a flurry of realignment in the late 40s and early 50s as schools sought a slice of the TV revenue pie. Many of the schools on the move sought to join conferences that already contained prominent programs. Colorado left the Mountain States Conference, renamed the Skyline Conference, to join the Big Six, which thankfully changed its name to the Big Seven. Oklahoma State joined a little bit later, bringing the conference total and the conference name up to 8. Texas Tech departed the BIAA and joined the Southwest Conference. New Mexico also departed the BIAA to replace Colorado in the Skyline Conference along with Montana. The remaining BIAA would survive for the next few years, but with a drastically smaller group of schools, all desperate to stay afloat in the sea of cash now flooding college football. The Southern Conference, which had already been left behind once by the SEC, would be left behind again. This time, the 8 schools of Clemson, Duke, Maryland, North Carolina, NC State, South Carolina, Virginia, and Wake Forest would split off to form the Atlantic Coast Conference in 1953. The reason was that the Southern Conference had prohibited its members from attending postseason bowl games. The NCAA did not hold governance over these bowl games, and thus they were open season for TV networks to broadcast. Remember, attending a bowl game means big revenue for a team, from gate shares to sponsorship fees and now TV dollars. Missing out on bowl games meant missing out on dollar bills, and the ACC's new members wanted to make sure that they got a slice of dem fat stacks. Michigan State joined the Western Conference in 1950, which meant it could resume being called the Big Ten, finally. The Mid-American Conference formed out of the interstate conferences in the Midwest in the form of Ohio, Miami, Western Michigan, Toledo, Kent State, Bowling Green, and Marshall, and we've had MACtion ever since. Last of note, the unwritten and unspoken agreement among Eastern colleges formally organized into a conference with rules and a champion and everything. You know, just like the common folk. Elsewhere, things were looking pretty tough for conferences that couldn't find a nationally renowned school to be its face on TV. The Southern Conference persisted after losing 8 of its members to the newly formed ACC, retaining the high-visibility schools of West Virginia and Virginia Tech. The Missouri Valley Conference reduced to 6 schools after losing Oklahoma State, and adding Cincinnati to help buoy the conference regionally. And the Border Conference was running out of steam, down to 6 schools, with the largest 2, Arizona and Arizona State, starting to look elsewhere for a bigger share of the television bounty. In spite of the attractiveness of conferences in the new age of TV, a large number of schools opted for independence rather than a tightly controlled conference schedule. At the close of the 1950s, 27 schools were independent, and they were doing fairly well for themselves. Notre Dame and the service academies, which now included an Air Force, probably stand out as obvious mentions, but there was also Boston College, Florida State, Miami, Florida, Oregon and Oregon State, Penn State, Pittsburgh, Washington State, and Syracuse, who was also named the national champion in the final season of the 1950s. Wait, is there a national championship now? Well, kind of. Remember the phrase mythical championship I talked about earlier? Well, I was referring to the SIAA's practice of not officially declaring a conference champion at the end of the season, leading to the ability of many schools in the conference to claim that they were the rightful champions. After all, the SIAA was simply far too big for every team to play every other team. The same was true at the national level. Because the single best team in college football can never be decided competitively on the field, the college football community has relied on many methods, many with a high degree of subjectivity, in determining who the best team in the country is. Even today in 2019, the NCAA does not officially recognize a champion of Division I football. Don't rewind, you heard me correctly. There has never been and likely never will be an official NCAA Division I football national champion. Even the BCS and college football playoff winners are not formally recognized as champions. Those two organizations are private companies completely independent of the NCAA. So if someone asks you this coming bowl season, who do you think the national champion is going to be? You can say nobody. And you'd be technically correct. The best kind of correct. The first attempt at determining a national champion was the Dickinson system, which was created by Illinois economics professor Frank Dickinson. It was essentially a mathematical formula that awarded 30 points for a victory over a strong team, 20 for a victory over a weak team, defeats counting half as much as victories, 15 points versus a strong team, 10 points versus a weak team, and ties are considered as games half won and half lost, 22.5 points against a strong team, 15 against a weak one. As you can imagine, there was lots of disagreement, and that led to a number of other methods being used to select the national champion every year. Some were mathematical, and some were based on polls. The Associated Press, or the AP poll, was the first of these polls, and it essentially asks sports writers throughout the nation to rank all college football teams in the country in order from best to worst, 1 through 25. It was still pretty subjective, but at least it relied on the opinions of people whose job it was to watch college football and pay attention to it. And that was a level of subjectivity that most people were willing to accept. The first AP polling began in 1936, and at the end of that season it awarded Minnesota the title of AP National Champion. A second poll, this one of college football coaches instead of sports writers, was introduced beginning in 1950, and thus the idea of a consensus national champion was born. Basically, if the two polls could agree on the same team being the number one in the country at the end of a season, then congratulations! That team was the national champion. Probably. This is what made the 1950s a hallmark decade for college football. There were gate revenues to collect, TV dollars to lobby for, conference rivals to compete against, and now a legitimate national championship to compete for. All of these things together made colleges want to compete even harder for nationwide prominence, and that meant that more change was coming. Look, I'm sure you figured it out by now. Oregon, Oregon State, and Washington State finally resolved their differences with the former members of the PCC, and they joined the AAWU in the 1960s, which became known as the Pacific Athletic Conference, or PAC-8. The BIAA and the Skyline Conferences essentially merged with one another as BYU, Colorado State, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico joined forces with Arizona, Arizona State, and UTEP to form the Western Athletic Conference. Also in the 60s, West Virginia and Virginia Tech left the Southern Conference to go independent. But another wave of change was coming, but this time from outside the world of college athletics. The 60s were a time of great social change, and college campuses were becoming racially integrated thanks to laws passed by Congress. College athletics would change in another way, but this time due to a congressional action based on gender equality. The NCAA did not sponsor championships in women's sports. Women's athletics still existed on college campuses, but they were not overseen by the NCAA, and that all changed in 1972 with the passing of Title IX. Title IX stipulates that no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Now, this is an extremely abbreviated summary and in no way comprehensive, but what it meant was that colleges now had to fund women's athletics in the same way that they funded men's athletics. This made athletic departments' budgets skyrocket, and some smaller schools found that they no longer had the money to fund competitive football teams in NCAA Division I. So as the rich got richer and the poor got poorer, the NCAA made official the distinction between the two classes of football in America. Division I was split into two subdivisions, 1A and 1AA. Division 1A schools were considered to be the top flight of college football, and they had a maximum of 85 scholarship athletes allowed on the team every season. 1AA schools only were allowed 63. In addition, 1A schools had to have a minimum average attendance requirement at all home games. 1AA schools did not have such a requirement. It meant that many familiar institutions of college football would be missing from TV screens across America as the NCAA culled the enormous herd. The Southern Conference, the Ohio Valley Conference, and even the Ivy League eventually got relegated to 1AA. The Missouri Valley Conference eventually stopped sponsoring football altogether. To the programs that survived in Division 1A, there was suddenly a very real threat that a slow slide into obscurity would result in a sudden loss of revenue in your college football program. In addition, with fewer schools in Division 1A competing for television dollars, there was suddenly more money for everybody else to have. Now there was a clamor all of a sudden for schools to take advantage of the new opportunities and also to protect themselves from fading into irrelevancy. And the floodgates were about to open. Again, look, I know that's 3 times, but we're not going to run out of floodgates anytime soon. Arizona and Arizona State left the WAC to join the Pac, now 10. The WAC replaced them with Air Force, Hawaii, and San Diego State, formerly of the Pacific Coast Conference. No, not the original PCC, a new one, without so many investigations. Speaking of the new PCC, they were joined by UNLV and Utah State, who had been independent for over 40 years. New Mexico State also joined in the early 80s as the Missouri Valley Conference ceased operations. The MAC added Ball State, Northern Illinois, Central and Eastern Michigan, which rounded out the directional Michigan collection. South Carolina went independent from the ACC, but Georgia Tech, who had went independent from the SEC in 1964, took their place. And just when things started to look like they were settling down, something interesting happened in the Supreme Court. Since 1956, the NCAA had regulated all aspects of television broadcasts of college football games. This was done at the will of the member institutions who wanted to protect their gate revenue from losses due to people not attending games in favor of watching them on TV instead. By the 1980s, the major television networks of America were submitting bids for the NCAA college football broadcasting contract for sums in excess of $100 million. Many of the larger schools in the NCAA saw that pile of money and they wanted to get their share of it. What they wanted was the ability to negotiate a TV contract for themselves. They banded together to form the College Football Association. The WAC, Big 8, Southwest, SEC, ACC, and all 44 independent schools joined in, representing a huge chunk of Division 1A and a lot of bargaining power. They began negotiating a separate television deal with NBC, while the NCAA was negotiating a deal between CBS and ABC. The NCAA officially warned the members of the College Football Association, but when they didn't back down, the NCAA threatened to sanction them. In response, the CFA sued the NCAA for violation of antitrust laws, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, who ruled in favor of the CFA. Suddenly, the TV market was blown wide open. Instead of one televised game per week like it was with the old contract, college football was being televised at a rapid clip, with 4 to 5 games being broadcast per time slot on national carriers. Initially, ABC won the rights to the CFA teams, and CBS won the rights to the Big Ten and Pac-10. So following the first successful revolution against the NCAA's authority, this is what college football looked like going into the mid-1980s. Not many huge changes occurred immediately as a result of the Supreme Court ruling, but it did light a very long fuse on a bomb that wouldn't detonate until much later. But first, there was some rumbling, and most of it was coming from the Southwest Conference. Scandal after scandal began emerging from the schools in the Southwest Conference during the 1980s. The state of Texas was at its wealthiest point ever, partly thanks to Reaganomics and partly thanks to the energy crisis of the late 70s that drove up the price of oil. Texans had money to throw around, and many of them threw it at their almas mater, the schools they used to go to. The excellent 30 for 30 documentary Pony Excess has covered this topic extensively, but the recruiting violations of the Southwest Conference schools in the 1980s were so excessive, rampant, and grandiose that every school except Arkansas, Baylor, and Rice had been placed on probation by the NCAA at some point during that decade. SMU had its 1987 football season famously canceled. Because sanctioned schools at the time were not permitted to appear on live TV, the schools were essentially punishing themselves by reducing the share of TV revenue that the conference was awarded every week. Arkansas, who saw no more financial point to staying in the Southwest, applied to join the SEC in 1991. South Carolina also joined. Speaking of TV revenue, the time bomb that the Supreme Court decision set off was finally about to blow up, and in 1991, we got the first shockwaves. Thank God I didn't say the word floodgate again. 1991 was the first year that the Big East began sponsoring football. Initially founded as a basketball-only league of schools, the Big East had seen wild success in the college basketball television market during the 1980s. Another great 30 for 30 documentary, Requiem for the Big East, goes into the specifics. Attempting to capitalize on the success of their basketball franchise, the conference voted to begin playing football. However, only 3 of the conference members actually fielded football teams: Boston College, Syracuse, and Pittsburgh. To round out their new league, they invited Miami, Rutgers, Virginia Tech, West Virginia, and Temple to the conference, and joined the College Football Association in order to secure televised games. All of those schools had previously been independent. Still independent was Notre Dame, and they were about to become even more so. Notre Dame was among the schools that had joined the College Football Association in the 1980s, and the victory in the Supreme Court had allowed the CFA to negotiate more lucrative TV deals for its members. In 1991, Notre Dame left the CFA, deciding to negotiate an exclusive deal with NBC. It's a deal that is still in place today. Another independent school, Penn State, was a major football powerhouse with a nationwide following, much like Notre Dame. In the early 90s, the Big Ten began courting Penn State, hoping to increase the conference's TV market share if Penn State were to join. The Big Ten was not a member of the CFA and could negotiate their own TV deals. Penn State, meanwhile, had already been considering aligning themselves with the conference. In fact, they had applied to join the Big East as a non-football member in 1982, but their application was rejected, a decision that I'm sure the Big East will never, ever regret. So when the Big Ten extended an invitation to Penn State, they accepted, and the Big Ten became, well, they stayed the Big Ten, but it did allow a graphic designer to get really creative with the conference logo. See the little oven? Do you see it? Do you see? Do you see it? Out west, the PCC was going through a grunge phase like everyone else in the 90s. They changed their name to the Big West before Fresno State left to join the WAC. They got a few piercings and tattoos, and they added Northern Illinois, Arkansas State, Louisiana Monroe, and Louisiana Tech, all for a healthier TV market share. In 1992, the ACC added Florida State and the MAC added Akron. And then the sky started falling. In 1994, the ground shook when the SEC announced that they would withdraw from the CFA and negotiate their own TV deal, which they got from CBS, worth almost $100 million. The Big East broke from the CFA and joined a TV partnership with CBS as well, but the loss of the SEC was a huge blow to the CFA. The remaining conferences began looking for the exits and for new TV markets to reach. The Big Eight, still in the CFA, reached out to Texas, Texas A&M, Texas Tech, and Baylor to establish a new power conference, the Big 12. They negotiated a TV deal for themselves with ABC, and the Southwest Conference, as well as the CFA, were effectively dead. SMU, TCU, and Rice joined the WAC after the Southwest Conference folded. San Jose State and UNLV also joined the WAC from the Big West. The Big West, meanwhile, wasn't ready to throw away their flannel just yet, even though recent additions Arkansas State, Louisiana Monroe, and Louisiana Tech decided to go solo, and Northern Illinois joined the more geographically reasonable MAC, along with Marshall and Buffalo, both previously independent. The Big West came out with a new album under a new lineup, keeping Nevada, Utah State, and New Mexico State while adding former independent artists Boise State, Idaho, and North Texas. Southwest Conference cast-off Houston joined forces with independent schools Southern Mississippi, Tulane, Memphis, Cincinnati, Louisville, East Carolina, UAB, and the Army to form Conference USA for the '96 season. Eventually, the WAC was running into the same too many schools problem that the SIAA and the Southern Conference found themselves in before, and 8 schools, Utah, BYU, San Diego State, New Mexico, Air Force, Colorado State, Wyoming, and UNLV, broke away to form the Mountain West Conference. Finally, the end of the 20th century, the era of conference chaos was over. Nah. But while we're here, we might as well hit pause and talk about the national championship. Again, it may come as a surprise to you, but the idea of a consensus national champion based on polls was a little bit controversial. Ever since it was introduced in 1950s, it had only grown more unpopular. Initially, there were only 2 polls used to determine the national champion, but as time went on, more and more polls got introduced into the sports media. Remember this list? As more and more polls entered the picture, the disagreements between them mounted up, and it led to the frequent occurrence of split national champions when the polls awarded 2 or more schools with the rank of number 1 at the end of a season. The first attempt to solve the differences in the polling system was an idea to force the number 1 and number 2 teams in the AP poll to play against each other in a postseason bowl game. This idea led to the formation of the Bowl Coalition in 1992. It arranged for 7 bowl games to host the champions and runners-up of 5 conferences, the SEC, Big 8, Southwest, ACC, and Big East, as well as Notre Dame. Out of this pool of teams, the number 1 and 2 ranked teams would be set aside to play in a bowl game against each other, the location of which would rotate between the 4 oldest and most prestigious bowl games, the Cotton, Fiesta, Orange, and Sugar Bowls. If you notice some things missing, then you're correct. This system excluded the Big 10 and the Pac-10. Both conferences had long-standing agreements with the Rose Bowl to send their respective conference champions to that game instead. This obviously did not eliminate the possibility of a split national champion if either a number 1 or a number 2 ranked team were a member of either the Big 10 or the Pac-10, then we would have a split national champion, and this did occur once in 1994. Number 1 ranked Nebraska was declared the national champion after playing and winning the Orange Bowl, even though the number 2 ranked team in the country at the time, Penn State, did not play them. They were instead playing a Pac-10 opponent in the Rose Bowl. So in 1995, the Bowl Alliance evolved out of the Bowl Coalition after the Big 12 was formed following the death of the Southwest Conference. This opened up a larger pool of mid-major conference schools to participate in the selection process, but it still did not include the Pac-10 or Big 10. Yet another split national championship occurred in the 1997 season. That's why in 1998, the Bowl Championship Series was founded. The organization generated its own ratings based on formulas and composites of multiple polls and other mathematical rankings, and it also included the Big 10 and Pac-10. It also included many other mid-major conferences that had been left out of previous systems. So with a new championship system in place at the turn of the 21st century, it didn't take long for things to get rather insane rather quickly. Because the new BCS system gave guaranteed bowl bids to the champions of the SEC, Big 10, Pac-10, Big 12, Big East, and ACC, those conferences remained relatively stable. They represented the automatic qualifying conferences and could rely on a sizable portion of the big BCS bowl game money every season. It was in the so-called non-automatic qualifying conferences, the Mountain West, WAC, Big West, Conference USA, and MAC, that most of the turmoil occurred. These conferences had the possibility of sending teams to the BCS bowl games, but not the guarantee. A team from these mid-major conferences could play their way into the BCS, but only if they played well against a strong schedule. Then the BCS formula would rank them favorably. And so, something about floodgates again. The Big West finally moved out and got itself a real job, and its former members jumped to other mid-major conferences. Nevada, Boise State, and Louisiana Tech joined the WAC. TCU jumped from the WAC to Conference USA. The remaining ex-Big Westers and some former independents formed the Sun Belt Conference: Louisiana Lafayette, Louisiana Monroe, Arkansas State, Middle Tennessee, North Texas, Idaho, Utah State, and New Mexico State. This was the situation in 2003, but the urge to shuffle would soon strike again. By 2005, 3 schools had left the Big East for the ACC: Virginia Tech, Miami, and Boston College, due to the attraction of a richer TV deal and signs of instability in the Big East. Another Big East member, Temple, left to become independent for a season before joining the MAC. To make up for the sudden membership loss, the Big East extended invitations to Louisville and Cincinnati to join from Conference USA, added Connecticut, who was a basketball-only Big East member, to the football schedule, and invited new football program South Florida. Conference USA responded in turn by inviting Marshall from the MAC, Rice, UTEP, Tulsa, and SMU from the WAC, and Central Florida, who was also a brand new football program. Strangely, TCU abandoned Conference USA for the Mountain West in spite of their former Southwest Conference colleagues joining that year. Maybe there were still some hard feelings. Additionally, Army chose independence, which was simultaneously patriotic and ironic since the conference they left was Conference USA. After the exodus from the WAC, or the Waxodus, they rebounded by inviting Idaho, New Mexico State, and Utah State to join. The Sun Belt, who appeared to be left standing without a chair after the music ended, instead invited 1AA schools Florida Atlantic, Florida International, and Troy, and would soon after add Western Kentucky. Now, we haven't been talking hardly at all about the BCS automatic qualifying conferences. In fact, 2005 was the first time in over a decade that any of the power conferences had changed their membership rosters when the ACC added 3 schools. The Big 12, Big 10, SEC, and Pac-10 had been stable for years, and for a good reason. They had no need to change. They were earning consistent revenue from their individual TV deals, they were guaranteed to send representatives to prestigious and well-paying postseason bowl games, and the Big 12 and SEC even had conference championship games in the final week of the season. That earned them extra TV revenue. Life was good for the major conferences. But one conference in particular thought that life could be better. The Big 10 in 2007 did something that no other conference had done before in the history of college athletics. They partnered with Fox Sports to create a TV network exclusively for Big Ten sports programming, which they called the Big Ten Network. Look, they've had 11 members since 1990. I don't think they're ever going to budge from the Big Ten naming convention. Big Ten's contract with ESPN was coming due for renewal, and ESPN was unwilling to pay the much higher fees that the Big Ten was demanding of it. So the Big Ten began exploring the idea of launching their own conference-specific network with Fox, which they announced before the 2006 season. In 2007, the network launched, and it was almost immediately successful. The revenue from the new network, and just the new network, amounted to $6.4 million distributed to each school. Other conferences, like the eventual Pac-12, the SEC, and the ACC, would eventually follow by starting their own TV networks. The Big Ten had found a gold mine, and if we've learned anything about money in college sports thus far, it's that if some is good, then more is better, and the Big Ten wanted more. Specifically, they wanted a wider geographic reach for their new network. Also, they wanted to be able to host their own conference championship game like the SEC and the Big 12. In order to achieve both of those goals, the Big Ten needed more members. So they began exploring the idea of expansion. Buckle in. Rumors immediately began swirling that Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, and Rutgers were all being considered for invitation. Kansas, Missouri, and Rutgers had all been linked to the Big Ten in the past. In 1990, after Penn State joined the conference, Missouri expressed interest in joining as well. This would have brought the membership total to 12, the minimum mandated by the NCAA in order to host a conference championship game after the regular season. The Big Ten even considered adding all 3 of those schools to bring the membership total to 14. However, that idea died in 1995 when the Big 12 was formed from the union of the Big 8 and the remnants of the Southwest Conference. Then Rutgers joined the newly formed Big East. The Big Ten's hopes for expansion then rested on Notre Dame, but independence was simply too lucrative for the Fighting Irish, who would likely lose money by abandoning their exclusive TV deal with NBC. When the Big Ten formally announced its potential expansion plans in late 2009, it appeared that the Big 12 would be the most threatened. After all, Kansas, Missouri, and Nebraska had all been charter members of the Missouri Valley Intercollegiate Athletic Conference in 1907, and all 3 schools had been intrinsically linked both by geography and by rivalry ever since. With the Big 12's blood in the water, the Pac-10 announced its own plans to expand shortly after the Big Ten's announcement. The Pac-10's plan included Colorado, Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, Texas, and Texas Tech as prospective new members. Death appeared to be knocking at the Big 12's door, and its member schools could sense it. So Colorado applied for and was accepted into the Pac-10 for the 2011 season. The very next day, Nebraska applied for and was accepted into the Big Ten. It was lost on no one that the Big Ten now had 12 members and the Big 12 now had 10 members. Rousing laughter was heard throughout the nation, believe me. But on a serious note, the Big 12 had been gut-shot. Without 12 members, there could no longer be a postseason conference championship game under NCAA rules. That was a major chunk of TV revenue that the Big 12 would stand to lose. The remaining 10 schools started looking for the lifeboats. The Pac-10 continued to negotiate with Texas, Texas Tech, Oklahoma, and Oklahoma State about joining. Rumors circulated that invitations had been extended to all 4, but Texas backed out and announced they would remain in the Big 12. Shortly after, the other 3 invitees did the same. Instead, the Pac-10 invited Utah into the conference, bringing the membership to 12, and for the first time in modern history, a conference renamed itself to accurately reflect its number of members. Good for them. With the loss of their traditional in-state rival Utah, BYU left the Mountain West to become independent. The conference then invited Boise State to take their place. But with the Big 12 still reeling, yet somehow still intact, rumors continued circulating that the chaos wasn't over yet. The rumors had to do with the reason why Texas had declined its invitation from the Pac-10 in the first place. I mean, a move would have made sense at the time, leaving a conference of chaos and instability for a conference that was relatively safe. So what exactly made Texas, and by extension Texas Tech, Oklahoma, and Oklahoma State, stay in the conference and potentially secure the existence of the Big 12? The answer has never really been clear, but the next spring in 2011, Texas announced the launch of the Longhorn Network, a TV network devoted to the University of Texas athletics. The Longhorn Network was a lot like the BTN, except instead of a network for just one conference, this was a network devoted to just one school. It was an action comparable to Notre Dame's exclusive deal with NBC and represented an effort to build and expand Texas' nationwide reach. Most importantly to the matter at hand, the Longhorn Network would begin broadcasting select Texas football games in the coming season. Many of those games were scheduled against fellow Big 12 opponents. Critically, it meant taking TV revenue away from those opponents and giving it to Texas. Many speculated that the Texas to Pac-10 rumors were only meant to force the Big 12 leadership into allowing the Longhorn Network to be launched in the first place. Others speculated that the Longhorn Network was already an idea in motion during negotiations with the Pac-10, who would not allow Texas to join if they launched their own TV channel. Whatever the reason, the existence of the Longhorn Network infuriated the other Big 12 schools. Opponents scheduled to have their games against Texas broadcasted on the Longhorn Network flatly refused to play. In this environment, Missouri and Texas A&M left the Big 12 following the 2011 season to join the SEC. Faced again with the threat of extinction, the Big 12 then invited TCU from the Mountain West and West Virginia from the Big East to maintain a 10-team league. The Mountain West, now down to 7 teams, reached out to the WAC to add Fresno State, Hawaii, and Nevada. This left the WAC reeling, and even though they would later add Texas State and Texas San Antonio from Division I AA, the WAC folded in 2012. Former members found conference homes elsewhere, but there was about to be a new wrinkle as beginning in the 2014 season, the BCS was eliminated in favor of a 4-team playoff containing teams selected by a 13-member selection committee, whose members included former secretaries of state and Army chiefs of staff because the committee ranks teams weekly throughout the season, favoring teams with a strong schedule. In other words, teams in the strongest 5 conferences, the ACC, Big 10, Big 12, Pac-12, and SEC. These became known as the Power 5 conferences, while the American, Conference USA, MAC, Mountain West, and Sun Belt became what was known as the Group of 5. There's also the Fast 5, but nobody really talks about them. This ignited another rush of activity as conferences scrambled to add teams to improve their strength of schedule, and thus their standing with the playoff committee. The Big 10 added Maryland from the ACC and Rutgers from the Big East in 2014. In response, the ACC grabbed Louisville, Pittsburgh, and Syracuse from the Big East, which now found itself with only 3 football-playing members. The remaining 7 were basketball-only schools, and those 7 schools decided to leave, but they took the Big East Conference name with them to begin a basketball-only conference once again. The 3 leftover members, Cincinnati, UConn, and South Florida, formed the American Conference along with UCF, East Carolina, Houston, Memphis, SMU, Temple, Tulsa, Tulane, and Navy. 7 of those new American Conference schools came from Conference USA, who extended invitations to Sun Belt members Middle Tennessee, North Texas, Florida Atlantic, Florida International, and Western Kentucky to replenish their depleted ranks. They would also promote 1AA programs Charlotte and Old Dominion to the conference. The Sun Belt, once again the smallest conference, promoted 4 previous 1AA programs to their ranks: Georgia State, Appalachian State, South Alabama, and Georgia Southern. And the conference Ragnarok was over. Speaking of large-scale death and destruction, another casualty of the wave of realignment in the 21st century was the idea of independence in college football. Remember when the College Football Association was formed to lobby for an independent TV deal? That was in 1981, and 44 independent schools were founding members of the CFA back then. Now, in 2019, that number is only 7. Even Notre Dame, once proudly independent, has an agreement to reserve 5 games on its schedule per year against opponents from the ACC for the all-important benefit of maintaining a strong resume against a Power 5 conference. So here we are now in the final season of the 2010s with a brand new decade of college football upon us. With the geographic boundaries of college football now etched into the very soil of America, I am positive that this is what the landscape of the NCAA will continue to look like forever and ever and ever. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed watching my little video. I had fun making it. This is a brand new thing for me, but I hope to do more video projects like this in the future concerning sports and geography. So if you have an idea for a topic that you'd like me to discuss, please leave a comment below and I'd be happy to get to it at some point in the future. Or if you'd just like to share your thoughts on this particular subject, leave me a comment below, maybe a question, I'll be happy to answer them. I hope to do more videos like this in the future, so if you'd like to be updated whenever that happens, you can subscribe and hit notifications in order to be aware when I upload my next video. Once again, thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.